For thousands of years, humans have sung together, creating harmony, beauty, community, and joy. Here on How Can I Keep From Singing, we talk about this ancient and powerful art form, exploring that power, some of the rationales, and some of the how-to. I'm your host, Stuart Stotts, coming to you from rural Wisconsin. My guest today is Jake Johnson. Jake Johnson is a cultural historian and author whose work focuses on the intersection of music, myth, and community in American life. His books, such as Mormons, Musical Theater and Belonging in America, and Lying in the Middle, Musical Theater and Belief at the Heart of America, explore how musical theater and storytelling enable people to shape identity, belief, and belonging outside major cultural centers. Through his interdisciplinary approach, Johnson explores the everyday role of music as a form of world-building and myth-making, drawing insights from diverse communities. His writing bridges American studies, performance studies, and voice studies, inviting readers to consider the powerful ways musicals mediate truth, fiction, and collective memory. Jake, welcome to How Can I Keep From Singing?
Hi, Stuart. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Let's start with your own background as a musician. I know that you're a pianist and a vocal teacher and so on. Talk a little bit about your own early experience with music and how it's brought you to this moment personally.
So I began as a pianist in a very small town. I took lessons from some local teachers, and within a few years was playing in church activities. And I think I was in middle school when I began to be the accompanist for the high school choirs. So I got kind of torn around on different tours and different competitions and stuff with choirs early on. And once I got to college, that skill set as an accompanist really paid off. I was able to make some extra money as a pianist in various voice studios. For the last 20 plus years, I've been spending most of my time in voice studios in one way or the other, whether as a pianist or as a musical director or as somebody now who thinks a lot about the power of voice in a more academic way.
Let's talk about the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. Let's go right to this because it was so fascinating to me to read a little bit about this and hear you talk about it in another interview. Tell us, first of all, a little bit about the history of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. I do know it began in 1847, and it's also the longest running radio show, or one of the longest running radio shows, starting in 1929. Can you tell us a little bit about that history?
It's a fabulous history, and I'll preface it by saying the full and much more poetic history of this can be found in Michael Hicks's book on the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. I highly recommend, very readable and very applicable, even if you're not a Mormon or has seemed to be in the orbit of Mormonism at all. But yes, the choir has been around for a very long time, and in the 1920s, the church began a radio program called Music and the Spoken Word, that is the longest running radio program of its kind in the country, at least, and recently celebrated its 5,000th episode. And so it's just been around for a long time, and the choir has been a centerpiece of this since its inception. But I think the early Mormon church, or what we say like the late 19th century Mormon church, was very different in conception from how a lot of Mormons are perceived today. It was a bit more edgy, more rugged. There was a lot more radical edges to its theology that hadn't yet been pruned by the time you get to the middle part of the 20th century. And that transition from a more roguish frontier religious group to, by the time you get to the 1950s, this kind of well-coiffed hair, very corporate America look. The choir was really responsible for a lot of that transition in helping the church choose a more mainstream set of values that became more widely acceptable, getting rid of polygamy, for instance, or the kind of proto-socialist worldviews that it had inherited, and accepting more mainline value systems. So the choir becomes a emblem of wholesome activity, especially if you think like mid 20th century values of families were singing together. Singing together became also this large metaphor for what it means to belong and to be accepted. So learning to struggle to sing in harmony with one another, to find union, to seek some kind of tonal center. Those are all great metaphors for what it means to try to bring yourself to the middle of a group that you haven't always felt accepted by or necessarily wanted to be a part of. That's a very thumbnail view of it, but it's a really interesting history from the late 19th century to the middle of the 20th century of how Mormons got to where they are. And the choir was a huge, huge, huge part of that narrative and how they so successfully got where they are.
You talk about the belonging, but you also talk about the discipline of the choir, the music. Can you just talk about that a little more?
Yeah, it's hard work to sing in choir. Has anyone ever done this before, whether as an amateur or as a professional? And the discipline it takes to choose a collective over an individual, for instance. And just a really pat example is when you're singing in a choir, you really should be. You're often told to not be listening to yourself so much. If you can hear yourself over the others, you're not blending. And that takes a lot of extra self-awareness. And in some way, it's a small degree of sacrifice of learning how to blend and be a part of something that's larger than yourself. And that discipline was also really important for Mormons who had been perceived as undisciplined, whether that is by having multiple wives or by behaving in ways that just weren't acceptable in 19th century worldview. Singing in a choir, especially a massive choir like the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, or what's today called the Tabernacle Choir, would be, again, such a strong token towards and gesture towards what it means to belong in America writ large. And in the book on Mormons and musical theater, I really go one step further in thinking about that voice is such a key part of being in America and belonging, that it's not just a metaphor in choirs and religious groups, but learning how to be a part of a democracy where we often say, let your voice be heard. These are really active, metaphors or ways of thinking, but they also matter in a real concrete way about how to learn to be among other people who are different from you, or how to allow yourself to have space whenever you need to have space, to speak into issues, to learn to be silent around issues. Those are all qualities of being an American. And I think this kind of strange story of Mormons and the choir and vocal culture in America really does point to some larger issues and trends within the country itself that I think are just so fascinating.
I want to come back to that in just a minute. But first of all, there's the Tabernacle Choir, as it's known now, which is this very large cultural icon and so on. How does that choir relate to the larger tradition of music in Mormon culture?
It's a great question. So, yeah, the Tabernacle Choir is kind of it's almost like a brand of Mormonism, and people encounter that maybe before or without encountering any other parts of Mormonism. Singing and voice culture and choirs is a big part of Mormon culture on a very amateur level as well, in a very family-centered way. So families sing together frequently. Singing is a part of the regular Sunday services. I even point to this really strong habit and trend within Mormonism towards musical theater as being another indicative nature of how important voice is. Theologically, in the Book of Mormon and also other kinds of scripture that Mormons gravitate around, there's a lot of examples of where people and godlike creatures speaking and having the power to manipulate their voices to achieve a certain end that's seen as righteous. So tricking somebody with your voice to sound like somebody else, for instance, that's something that God often allows and encourages. And putting on a costume to pretend like you're somebody else in order to trick somebody, those are seen as righteous means to, or maybe interesting means to a righteous end. And voice culture becomes a key part of that. And so I think theologically, Mormonism is built around the voice in ways that are really interesting. So when it manifests in a choir at a grand level, like the Tabernacle Choir, that's obviously gets a lot of eyeballs on what's going on. But even at a very fundamental level, voice is really the keystone of the religion, to the degree that I call Mormonism a theology of voice, that it's built around voice in such a peculiar way that no scalpel is sharp enough to cut away voice from Mormonism without it really all coming with it.
Great. And I want to come back to that term, the theology of voice, because I think it's pretty central to what we're talking about. But first, just a more practical question. When Mormons are singing in families or small groups or whatever, is it always religious, or is there a secular aspect to the music that they're singing?
Oh, yeah, it's a good blend of lots of things, like general American culture is as well. Mormon churches used to, although I don't think this is nearly as common anymore, have what they would call road shows, where different congregations would kind of put on a skit or a talent show night, loosely organized, but sometimes they were pretty tightly knit as some kind of a show, like a production. And kids all the way up to the adults and multi generations would be involved in this. And that might include hymns, but it would often include musical theater tunes, something from Sound of Music. So I think the what counts as being sacred is pretty broad, and that goes back to Joseph Smith's value sets about Mormonism. That it was really the synthesis tool that was able to navigate all the world's things, all the ideas that exist in the world, and discern, like with a little meter, what was true and what about it and what was not true about it. And so Mormons really saw themselves as kind of grabbing all the world's ideas, sifting through them, applying a set of criteria to them, and seeing what is true and what is not. And I think that applies to music as well. So if something comes from Rodgers and Hammerstein and it speaks truth to them, then they're not going to discern about where it comes from. They're just going to say, "Oh yeah, this means something to us, that really we see ourselves in this story."
When they're singing together as a community, does it have elements of what I might call sort of the ecstatic experience of being, for example, like a gospel choir, where you're really in the music and or I was raised in a Protestant church where the music is sort of very, you sing the song, but there's no strong feeling there, right? And I'm sure there's a range there, but what are people aiming for?
Yeah, there can be a range. I think historically, the singing in Mormonism, I'm thinking again back to the 19th century, was much more emphatic and speaking in tongues. It was much more evangelical, if I could just use a general term, than it is seen as today, which is much more mild mannered, everything kind of a little more vanilla, a little more bland. I don't use these terms negatively. It's just kind of a way of describing the musical scene. And I think that has a lot to do with the church's eventual movement again towards that middle ground. Is the more ecstatic religious expressions become either taboo or not something they want to draw attention to. So they accept this more like four-part harmony. We're all singing things that are pretty staid, all in the slowish meter. Now, the Tabernacle Choir does a wider variety than that than you would see in a typical Mormon household or in a service. They're singing a wide range of things with really fabulous arrangements, and they got the whole orchestra with them. So you're getting a fuller picture. But yeah, I think even though there is a wide range of expression within Mormonism, I wouldn't want to paint it in just one color. I think most Mormons would kind of see themselves in a very standard middle of the road style of singing that's not too ecstatic. It's a more reverent, I think, is the word they would use.
You've been to hear the Tabernacle Choir, I assume?
Yes.
You can't really write a book about them without going.
That's right.
I never have. What's it like to go there to the heart of that?
It's very special. So the performances in the tabernacle itself, the tabernacle is an old historic building that was built out of it's kind of a triumph of will. The organ itself is really massive and has a special story attached to it. If you think about these structures existing on the frontier, many, many, many miles away from any other kinds of civilization that would have been privy to building a tabernacle with an organ, for instance, it is pretty remarkable that we have intact these spaces. So that alone is a broad history. Acoustically, it's a really special space. Now, the Tabernacle Choir sings in more places than just the tabernacle, including in what's now called the Conference Center, which is a much more corporate, larger space that the church holds its meetings, its regular meetings in, which is also a fabulous space. You get a sense of this if you ever watch their Christmas programs, which are really wonderful to watch every season. The space is decorated to the nines. You really do get a sense of the opulence that's not opulent in the way that we see with more high church areas. I mean, it's not austere. We get a lot of Christmas trees that are just decorated really beautifully, for instance. That feels really homey, and there's a wholesomeness to it. There's something really American about it, like a huge living room. And that, I think, carries across in the way that the choir carries itself and the way that the radio program continues to reach into Americans' homes every week.
And I assume that being part of the audience, the music is just filled with power and washes over you.
Yeah, music is something that's fundamentally vibrations, right? So when we're an audience member watching, experiencing a production like that, the music hits you in your body and vibrates all throughout. And there's this really special experience of, and we've all been there. We've all been in a kind of performance together as an audience that we are, in a sense, vibrating together. And there's something really special about experiencing together an event like a choir concert, whether it's as grand as the Tabernacle Choir or, a kid's middle school play, it's still something special. And if we pause to reflect on that, for that moment, we're all in vibrational unity. That's really something remarkable.
You're listening to How Can I Keep From Singing? My name is Stuart Stotts, and my guest today is Jake Johnson. Let's come to this idea of theology of voice, which you talk about. Could you just, first of all, just talk a little bit more about it? I find the phrase fascinating in itself.
So this comes out of my first book, which is on Mormons and musical theater. And, I arrived at this idea that Mormons essentially and theologically were grounded in this concept of voice or vocality, speaking like somebody else, learning to discipline your voice in a particular way to achieve godliness or to achieve righteousness or to be more like God or a religious leader. You can do that. You can be like somebody in a lot of ways, but speaking like them is something that happens sometimes accidentally. And if I can step outside of Mormonism for just a moment, if you think about every voice you've heard throughout a lifetime, whether that's on the radio or from a parent or a grandparent or just the broader community, that you now speak as a committee, that in some ways all those voices are a part of who you are. They've disciplined you. So we've been taught in voice lessons, as my friend Mazi Asari calls it. We've all been taught in voice lessons throughout our lives, whether we are singers or not. We have been taught how to be and how to use our voice. And so I love the idea of thinking about when I speak, for instance, to you, Stuart, it's a committee of people coming out. And when you speak to me, it's also this committee. So we are individuals, but we're also grafted onto this larger vocal legacy that's partly genetic and a lot to do with culture. And so when I think about a theology, like a religion that's built around voice, that to me is a really powerful metric for thinking about how the individual and the collective, both in the sense of in the present, but also in the very distant past, how there's this long legacy of sound that comes out with me. The other part of that is that the earth in some ways can be imagined as this resounding bell, like an archive of sounds that has still floating through the atmosphere. And there was one physicist in the 19th century who imagined that actually everything is still vibrating at just at a slower pace somewhere. And if we had a strong enough microphone, this is when that technology was just emerging. If we had a strong enough device, then we could decode that and then play back, I don't know, the Sermon on the Mount or anything that had ever been uttered into the earth is still floating around us. And I don't think that's really possible, but I also believe that it's a really wonderful way of thinking about how sounds matter and how we can locate ourselves within a broader community, both historically and in the present and in the future. What our sounds, what we're contributing to the world as being theologically a sense of voice that's always here and always retrievable somehow.
So this idea of a committee of voices, it also applies even more specifically to singing, so that whatever we have taken in through hearing music or singing with other people becomes embodied in our voices as we sing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We're like a walking bibliography. We're always citing, like in the sense that an academic is citing. You're always footnoting your various voices. And what's really wonderful is that we're hardly ever aware of that. I mean, who pauses to think this is the voice of so-and-so coming out now? But, I think there's a great truth to the things we say, the little cliches we pick up, the manner in which we speak, the way we emphasize words as being something that we've been taught and we've learned from a wide variety of people.
So then to take that one step further, it seems to me that the music that we would hear or make as part of a group singing would have a larger impact than simply the things that might filter into us one at a time through an earbud or a radio speaker. The power to shape voice is even stronger in a community context.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of this as the voice showing more than it tells. So the voice is not simply a medium carrying information, but the medium itself is the information. This is the Marshall McLuhan idea of the medium as the message. So when I speak, it's not just words. It's if I subtracted the words from my voice, what's left is something that feels really individual. And it can be. Maybe even people have theorized that the soul is attached to this, right? It's my essence is speaking. But it can also be more complicated and ingratiated within other kinds of being, other kinds of people, other ideas. And so, yeah, so whenever we are singing in a choir or experiencing somebody in a choir singing to us, then I think we have an opportunity to tap into this larger way of thinking. That what we're hearing has a very long tail that extends in places that we wouldn't have thought about before. And it's in a way a great practice for living a different reality, for living in a different set of spaces that is, I think, more connected or has more possibility of connection.
Yeah, this idea of embodying what you have heard and what you've experienced and embodying that as part of a group as well, then bringing all that you have heard, if you're this melange of sound that you've heard throughout your life, and then how that joins together in a choir, and both the sense of belonging, the sense of individual, and also the sense of, like, as you talk about discipline, that it's not all about your voice. You are part of this larger thing. It's a metaphor, but it's also a very direct indication of what group singing is. How does this get reflected in other group singing traditions? I don't expect you to be an expert on it, but if I think about something like Gregorian chanting, for example, which is way back when choral singing began, you had single lines and they gradually expanded. How does this fit in a larger context?
Oh, there's lots of ways. So yeah, this little slice of Mormonism and the Tabernacle Choir is representative of some larger trends, but not exhaustive of them. So there's been a lot of interesting musicological studies of composers like Hildegard, who wrote in this chant style that you're describing, who would have in her monastery, her nuns sing while they proceeded. So they were singing while they moved and did different activities together that were all ritualistic. In her mind, the singing was meant to represent the values of Mary and of birthing Christ. So while they were singing about this, they were also moving through the space in a way that conjured those values and those ideas. So the voice becomes a edification, a tool of edification, of teaching you what it's like to be Mary, while she is contemplating this greatest gift to the world, and raising and birthing and being intimate with this person. This idea of the power of group singing goes well back. I mean, there's who knows where this really begins, but we have a strong attachment to people because of when we hear them singing. Think of the voices we like to hear on the radio that are often disembodied. We grow comfort by listening to those voices again and again. We love the voices of people that we love. We want to keep those voice memos of people who are no longer here because we want to return to them somehow. And there's a whole other line of thinking about in today's world when we can capture voices rather easily, that we don't really get the benefit, if you want to put it this way, of losing a voice. We never actually have to say goodbye to a voice. We can always keep it near and dear to us. And that's a new thing for humans to be able to do. Once somebody was gone from our world, we would often lose the voice. We would have no way of remembering or remembering very well how somebody sounded. So all the more important to think about that we carry them with us. We carry those voices and they come out when we speak.
And then there are traditions that feel like recording a voice is not right. For example, I live in a community where there are many Amish people who have an incredibly powerful tradition of singing together. It shocked me when I learned about it, but it's completely live. You don't walk in there with a tape recorder, let's put it that way. So, do you get the opportunity to sing as part of a choir yourself these days?
I'm not really a singer, so I work with singers all the time. And yeah, I'll sing with choirs as the occasion arises, but professionally, I haven't sought that out. I work a lot with musical theater, as you can imagine, from the kind of books I've been working on as a musical director and a pianist. And I've spent a lot of time in voice studios of various kinds. So I get to observe and absorb it by proxy, perhaps more than most people are able to. But I gotta say, especially in the holidays, it's just such a strong sense of like we should be singing together. We should be gathering around a piano. I'm tender towards those ideas, or hearing a choir sing in church, singing those songs we love. When "O Come All Ye Faithful" comes on, I mean, who can't join in?
I think in society now there is this real sort of push-pull between being entertained and listening and a consumer. And yet when people have the opportunity to experience the power of singing together, something happens. And those opportunities increasingly you have to seek out as opposed to having them built into many people's lives. Jake, it's been fascinating to talk with you here today. I'm deeply grateful for your work and your thinking about all of this. I will put information in the notes about your publications and where to dig deeper into these concepts. But thank you so much for being part of this.
I really appreciate it, Stuart. It's great to chat with you and always to think through these ideas together and to think through the power of singing. It's a great project. I appreciate it.
Production of Common Arts. My name is Stuart Stotts, and my guest today was Jake Johnson.